So last month, I was not here. Father Wiseman began his talk on the common good, which he will complete at some point at a later date. He's still working on it. Plus, he's a little more flexible than some of our speakers being in-house. I also had the experience of watching one of these meetings on our internet feed, and Tim was messing around with things, so it didn't turn out that well. The other thing that was notable was it's just a video of somebody talking. It's not that exciting. Kept wanting to send in to the moderator to tell Father Wiseman to move around or make different facial expressions or put on a funny hat or something. I'd like to move around more, but then Tim would have to follow me. We're particularly for these talks by me and Father Wiseman, we're getting pretty philosophical. There is a reason for that. Philosophy is very much common sense, sort of codified. So things we all know, explained, shown why we all know them, why they're principles. And it's necessary because there are many obvious circumstances in which we simply act on the principles more or less naturally. But there are others where we have to know what the principles are in order to apply them, things that are a bit more complicated. And it pertains very much to moral theology. We spend a lot of time in the seminary when we study moral theology talking about even natural ethical principles. The most basic being do good and avoid evil. It's something that everybody knows, everybody does naturally, and then we have to talk about things like, well, what is the good and what is evil? Tonight I would like to talk to you about human acts, which sounds like a really riveting topic. Hopefully you won't all fall asleep. Knowledge and willing is what goes into making a human act. Aristotle pointed out that man is a rational animal. So man is an animal, but the specific difference, what makes him different from other animals, is this power of reason. So a human act is one that proceeds from the knowing reason and the moving will. So a dog sees food, he just goes for it if he's hungry. There's no consideration of whether or not that's the thing to do in this situation. For a man, on the other hand, we see, for example, $5. We recognize it as being $5. I know that's $5. I choose to pick it up. It's not simply motion by instinct. We make a distinction between what we call a human act and a simple act of man. An act of man being an act proceeding from a human being without the intervention of his reason and will. So, for example, breathing or digestion. We don't think about it. We don't choose to do it. We can choose to stop breathing. We can't really choose to stop digesting that I'm aware of, but it just happens. So they are acts that take place without us making any act of our reason or will. For us to speak about the morality of any action, it must be a human act. There is no morality to breathing or digestion in themselves. There's not a moral species there. And it's obvious, and this is what we learn in our catechism when we talk about the things necessary for a mortal sin. So you have to have something that is a grave matter, but you must have sufficient knowledge. That's the reason. You must know at least generally what it is that you are doing, and there must be sufficient consent as well, which means you have to choose it. So things that take place in your dreams, for example, the dreams you have at night while you're sleeping, those are not sins because you don't have the normal use of your reason. You're not choosing to do those things in the same way that you would, although it might seem like it. You don't choose them in the same way that you would when you're awake. The same thing if you're physically coerced into doing something, as they used to do with in certain times of persecutions of Catholics, making them step on a crucifix, where you physically take the person's leg and make him stomp on the crucifix. All right, he can't resist the physical force. That's not a sin, because his will is not engaged in doing that action. So briefly, we cannot be responsible if we do not know what we are doing and we do not choose to do it. The flip side of that is we are responsible if we know what we are doing and we choose to do it. The required knowledge for a moral human act, first we can talk about advertence, which is the attention of the mind to the action being done or the circumstances surrounding it. So a lot of different things can diminish our advertence. We already spoke about being asleep. Being half asleep diminishes advertence. Semi-consciousness, drunkenness, even distraction. Right? We're not thinking about what we're doing at a given moment. Our advertence is diminished. It's not something that's so important necessarily for matters pertaining to business, which is what we're primarily concerned with in the SJBMA. In general, when we're making business decisions, economic decisions, we tend to have full or nearly full advertence, unless we're in the habit of getting drunk at work or being semi-conscious or inhaling a lot of fumes of something. We can speak also of ignorance, which is simply absence of due knowledge. In the moral sense, it's absence of knowledge about the morality of an action or about the circumstances surrounding a particular action. And this lack of knowledge would impede a correct decision about morality. And this is a bit more interesting than advertence from the economic and business point of view. You can have ignorance of a law. You simply do not know that a moral law or a civil law exists. For instance, the prohibition of buying and selling on Sundays. There are certain people who just do not know that it exists. There may be ignorance of fact. Some circumstance bearing on the act's morality is unknown. So we don't know something about the particular situation. For example, somebody's trying to sell me something and it's stolen, but he doesn't tell me that. So I don't know that. That's ignorance of fact, not ignorance of the law. Invincible ignorance, which is talked about at great length in other areas, referring to baptism of desire and such like, means ignorance that cannot be overcome. So no knowledge of the law or the circumstance in question can be obtained with prudent diligence. So under normal circumstances, you're not in a position to find out that information. That doesn't mean that it's absolutely 100% totally impossible, but in the particular circumstances, the normal actions a prudent man would take to find out what he needs to find out, those are not sufficient to give you the full information. So for example, you're buying something that's stolen, but it's passed through 8 or 9 people's hands since it was stolen. It's, we can say, morally impossible for you to find out the origin of that. And invincible ignorance removes culpability. So you buy stolen goods, they've passed through many hands before they've reached you, there's nothing particularly suspicious about the circumstances, you're not culpable for receiving stolen goods, you don't owe anybody, you haven't committed any sin. Of course, if the real owner appears, you are obliged to return the thing that belongs to him, but that's another story entirely. It does happen, certainly, but again, it's not a question of culpability in that case. Vincible ignorance, which is the opposite, can be overcome with normal moral diligence. So, simply vincible ignorance, a prudent man will be able to overcome it with a moderate effort. It's not going to any great lengths. It's relatively easy to find out what one needs to find out. Then there's crass ignorance, which is a strong and deliberate lack of due diligence in learning what one needs to know in order to act morally. And we like this sometimes. We don't find out about the moral law because we're afraid that if we know what the moral law is, we're going to have to act morally. And that's going to get in the way of how we like to do things. it's grave negligence. Grave negligence in doing our duties to find out what we need to know in order to act morally. We also talk about affected ignorance, which is not just neglecting, but taking pains to not find out what one is morally obligated to do. You know, going out to sit in your car during the sermon at Mass just so you don't hear anything that might make you have to change your way of life, for example. We're deliberately ignorant and doing our best to avoid losing our ignorance. Vincible ignorance does not remove culpability, but rather adds to it, especially in the cases of crass and affected ignorance. So if we commit a sin because we don't know, when we're avoiding finding out, or are negligent in finding out, we are guilty of that sin committed. So that's the difference between invincible ignorance, no culpability. Vincible ignorance does not remove culpability, and crass and affected ignorance increase culpability. Right? We're running the risk of committing any number of sins, and we don't really care. And we're hoping it'll leave us something of a loophole to get out of it legally or morally or whatever. There is, for our economic and business life, a strict obligation not to allow ourselves to remain ignorant. Invincible ignorance, it happens not usually in regard to the law, but in regard to circumstances, like we already talked about. You buy from somebody who seems reputable without realizing that a particular item is stolen. And there's nothing that's going to giving you any indication that there's criminal activity going on. We're not, in that case, obliged to search in the entire history of every item that we buy. Vincible ignorance, on the other hand, is never an excuse of any kind. We have to be diligent in pursuing necessary knowledge. So firstly, knowledge of the moral law. Right? And we can't be satisfied with our First Communion Catechism for these purposes. There are the Ten Commandments, yes, and we need to know them, but there are applications of that to our business life. Regular study is a good idea, especially in things that pertain to our particular field. Hopefully these conferences will help with some of these things. Ideally, that's the point of them. But particularly anything that might relate to our particular field, we should have a knowledge about. So someone in sales should know about justice in regard to buying and selling, and about the obligation to be truthful. A doctor should have sufficient knowledge of bioethical matters that he's likely to encounter, and so on. Also, we have to have a knowledge of circumstances and the application of the law. So we cannot avoid finding out about the circumstances because it might be inconvenient from a business perspective. Right? We have a duty to do our best, taking normal precautions to make sure that we're acting justly. We should also take counsel. If you have an unusual circumstance and you don't know how you should act or what your obligations are, ask somebody who can help. That's part of my job as chaplain of the SJBMA, is to be able to provide you with the necessary moral theology for difficult cases. It doesn't mean you need to call me up every time you make a sale or hire somebody or whatever, for more complicated cases. And it's important to remember in regard to this that we're trying to reestablish the reign of Christ, which is especially the reign of charity, but charity presupposes justice. Our obligations in charity are added over and above what we owe in justice. So it's quite vain to hope to accomplish anything if we're not looking to reestablish justice, particularly in this area of business. And it's certainly vain to talk about it too if we don't even learn what we need to do in order to apply the reign of our Lord in our own lives. The principles of justice are based on the moral law, which is based on the reality of things as established by God. And our obligations as Catholics are added to that natural law. And they begin with that natural law, of course. So So much for the intellect. Right? We need to know in order to act reasonably, to act as a human being. And we have an obligation to know to the best of our ability about the circumstances that pertain to our, and the laws that pertain to our actions. Also, in order for an act to have moral value, whether positive or negative, good or bad, it must be voluntary. We must will to do it. We are neither punished nor rewarded for what happens by accident. Even in the civil law. Right? A freak accident that no one could possibly have foreseen is not a crime, unless you were doing something criminal and that caused the accident. Voluntary acts proceed from an intrinsic principle with knowledge of the end. That means they come from inside of us. There's something within us that sees an end and chooses it, sees a good and chooses the good. It's distinguished from violence. Violence proceeds from an extrinsic principle. That's what we talked about, some being physically forced to step on a crucifix. It's not a voluntary action. Something outside of you is making you move, not something inside of you moving you. And that thing inside that moves us is our will. We also distinguish the willing from what we call in moral theology and in ethics velleity, which is the I want it kind of. I want it, but I'm not willing to do what's necessary to attain it. It's merely wishing, or wouldn't it be nice if? Oh, I'd like to move out of my parents' basement, but it just seems like so much work. That's velleity. Right? We're not actually choosing the good. The good is within our reach, and we're not taking the means to attain it. It's certainly a disease of our time as well, laziness. Something that very often happens in the spiritual life. You know, St. Thomas's 3-point plan for becoming a saint: will it, will it, will it. And we don't see that. We see any number of people who are, well, I'd kind of like to be better. Well, how about you do this and this and this? Maybe not. That's velleity. It's also distinguished from what is merely permitted. Right? Sometimes we permit things that we don't really want. So somebody tries to steal my wallet. I'm afraid he might hurt me, so I hand it to him. Not because I want to give it to him, but because of an outside influence that's affecting my will. There's no will on my part that the theft takes place. I'd like to keep my wallet. So we distinguish the will from what's merely permitted, from velleity, and from violence. And that, I think, is fairly clear. All things that we generally understand, just made more explicit, which does help us to understand them more profoundly. Which leads us to a somewhat more interesting case, which is what we call the indirect voluntary. Moral theologians seem to love the indirect voluntary. You get all kinds of interesting and wacky and not necessarily particularly probable hypothetical indirect voluntary cases, just as a mental exercise. It's also spoken sometimes about as the principle of double effect. So an effect which is willed indirectly as the result of another act which is directly intended. So your action has two results. One of them is intended. One of them is not really intended, but one knows it's going to take place. One is good and one is bad. So the state of the question is it ever permissible to will an action when we know that an evil will result from our action? And oftentimes I think we have a common sense idea of whether or not we are responsible for an evil in such circumstances. Sometimes it's pretty clear. And certainly we all know, I hope, that the principle that the ends don't justify the means. So we can't do something bad so that good can come out of it. And we likewise know that an evil intention vitiates any act, even an act that's good in itself, if we're doing it for an evil reason, makes the whole act morally evil. So if we're performing charitable service to some old lady by cleaning out her gutters so we can get a better idea of the layout of her house so that we can rob it later, that cleaning of the gutters is not a good act, for example. Or even to say, to give alms, simply to impress people. Right? We don't really have any interest in charity. We're just trying to puff ourselves up. That vitiates the act. Very often we have mixed motives and things like that. We want to do good, but we also like that people notice and praise us. So an evil intention, an act done strictly for an evil intention, takes away any goodness of the act. There is, however, a lot of gray area, and we should know how to explain the reason for our actions and be able to figure out the right course of action in most circumstances, admitting that there are some very complicated cases where it's a good idea to consult somebody, particularly a priest. Some examples of things that you may have thought about. May I do business with someone who I know will use the money he makes from my business to support evil purposes? His company matches employee donations to Planned Parenthood, for example. Or may I sell my products to a company or individuals who may use it for an evil purpose? So I sell military supplies to a government that I know is going to use it for unjust wars. May I simply employ somebody who's going to use the money he makes in my business to do evil? So there are 4 conditions that are necessary. All of them are necessary to be in place for the indirect voluntary to be illicit. The action itself that's performed must be good or at least indifferent. This is the whole the ends don't justify the means. We can't do a bad act just because some good results from it. So we have to ask, to what is the act immediately ordered by its very nature? So murder, adultery, theft, lying, those things are evil in themselves. And the ends don't justify the means, so at no point can we use those to perform an action even if there is a good effect. Ordinarily, the actions done in business and economic life will be good in themselves or at the very least indifferent. So for example, paying one's employees, that is something that is positively good. Something indifferent, you have an operation, a factory, a store, or something, you make the decision to expand. Doesn't have a moral species by itself. That it could be good, it could be bad, depending on your intentions, etc. So, firstly, the action itself must be good or at least indifferent. Secondly, the good effect must be immediate, which means that there can't be the bad effect standing between your action and the good effect. The good effect cannot be the result of the evil effect. For example, your business is failing and you try as a last-ditch effort to cut your prices so low that you drive your competitors out of business, thereby giving all the business to you, thereby saving your business. In that case, you're saving your business, that's a good effect. But in between your action, cutting your prices, which is morally indifferent, there's an evil effect, which is you're driving your competitor out of business. You're doing him an injustice. So if the good effect, saving the business, is caused by the bad effect, destroying the livelihood of your competitors, you cannot do it. The good effect, we say, happens per se. So it's the direct result of the action, the natural result of the action, and the evil effect is per accidens. It happens accidentally, so to speak, due to particular circumstances and not depending upon the action itself. So, the action performed must be good or at least indifferent. The good effect must be immediate. and the end of the agent must be honest. An evil end corrupts all the means. From the point of view of morality, even those that are good in themselves. So if you're trying to do something evil, it doesn't matter what good thing you do on the way to get to the evil. The whole thing is evil. Action must be good or at least indifferent. Good effect must be immediate. The end of the agent must be honest. And there must be a proportionately grave cause. And this, of course, is the difficult one. It's determining whether or not that proportion is there. In general, we are responsible for the evil we could and should have prevented. So we don't want to take any evil effect lightly. The evil effect is a material sin, which can easily become a formal sin, meaning there's the matter of a sin there, even if there's not the will to sin. We cannot expose ourselves to the danger of formal sin without a sufficiently serious reason. And this cause is more necessary if the evil effect is grave. So the greater the evil effect, the greater must be the good effect, the good effect intended. The influence of this action on the evil is proximate, very closely related. The evil effect will certainly take place. It doesn't have to be, if there's just a remote chance of it happening, you don't need as strong of a reason for doing it. And also, if one has a particular duty of state to prevent the evil in question, then the proportion, the good attained must be very great. And some of your typical moral theology examples are bomber pilot in time of war is going to bomb a strategic bridge, flies close to the bridge and sees that there are children playing on the bridge. May he drop his bomb and blow up the bridge? The answer is yes, morally speaking. The death of the children is not intended. There is the action itself, the blowing up of the bridge, is morally indifferent. The death of the children does not cause the good effect, which is the destruction of the bridge for strategic purposes. And is there a proportionally grave cause? The saving of life, the winning of the war for the country of the bomber pilot. So it's an example that kind of makes us go. But it fulfills the conditions, and it's something that the conditions are something that always need to be applied when we're dealing with something of this nature. And a lot of the cases get kind of difficult, and sometimes there is debate even among moral theologians in particular cases. One of the fun ones is, may a woman to escape being raped jump from a window at such a height that her death is nearly certain? And that one I won't even mess with, because it's one of the most hotly debated. But again, it has to be, there can't just be a sort of gut reaction in a complex situation like that. There has to be an action on principle. You have to assess and make the best possible judgment and take counsel in that case, although if a young lady is in that situation, she's not likely to have the time to prepare a full analysis of the moral principles involved. But it's mostly an interesting intellectual exercise. But some of the questions we raised. May I do business with someone who I know will use the money he makes from my business to support evil causes? In general, yes. So the action you're doing is just ordinary course of business, morally indifferent in general, or even good. The good effect is your livelihood, and in fact his livelihood as well, and it's immediate. So there's the evil that he's doing with the money does not come between your business with him and the good effect and your livelihood. The end of the agent must be honest. So you're not selling to him so that he can make money, so that he can support evil causes. And then there must be a proportionately grave cause. You need to do business, and business with people who might not be so desirable to do business with. In general, can we prefer to do business with people who are not going to do those things? Can we avoid, as far as possible, doing business with those people? Yes, but there's not a strict moral obligation to do so, nor to check into every company that we deal with and to see where all of their money goes. We're doing business, and only a small percentage, relatively speaking, is even going to go for those things. So we're not, it's pretty remote to what we're doing. So it is a legitimate thing to do. May I sell my products to a company or an individual who may use it for an evil purpose? That depends quite a bit on circumstances. If a guy comes into your store to buy a gun and says that he needs it to shoot his mother, you can't sell it to him. But if you can't check into everybody who's buying a gun and say, well, I need to know that you're only going to use this for moral purposes, and it's just not possible. If you have reason to suspect that there's an evil effect very much imminent to this business transaction, you can't do it. But if there's no reason to think so, or that's quite remote, then you can. May I employ someone who uses his money for evil? Yes, because he's probably not only going to use his money for evil. He needs to feed himself and to clothe himself, and he has a right to make a living as well. You're paying him, that's a good thing. The good effect of him receiving the money does not cause the evil effect does not cause the good effect. Your end is honest, to give him an honest wage, and there is proportion there. Right? You need his services. He needs to have a livelihood as well. So you see that there are a lot of applications of this principle of double effect to business life, and it's something that is very interesting and sometimes can be kind of a fun thing to do to work yourself through a particular case. In past ages, in the time of Christendom, it was doubtlessly far easier to live a morally good life. The whole movement of society, politics, family, economic life was directed towards the good. And even 50 years ago, it was a lot more directed towards the good than it is now. We don't have that today anymore, and we need to work hard at reestablishing it. And to do this, we have to live by conviction. The principles that we profess as Catholics become the driving force of our life at every level. And just as a reminder, the purpose of this organization is to establish, spread, and foster these convictions in economic and business life. All right, on the business level, we're supposed to be helping you and other people to become men of principle. So really acting by Catholic principle, not just sort of going through the motions and being more or less like everybody else. We need to know and we need to will to perform truly human actions. And for an action to be truly Catholic, it must be a human act first of all. We can't just go with the flow, do what everyone else is doing, stick to our old habits, whatever. We need to think in a profoundly Catholic way, and this means doing our best to know what is good and to consistently choose it. And that's even on the natural level. Grace is then able to work and lift up and divinize these human acts. So make them, even the most mundane human acts, vehicles of grace for other people, for an increase in grace in ourselves. It's a good thing for a person who's not a Catholic or not in the state of grace to pay his employees. It's a better thing when a Catholic does it because he can do it for a supernatural end. There's supernatural merit to it. It can be a vehicle of grace even then for those employees. It's not simply a matter of avoiding sin. Our moral life, our business obligations are not simply a question of avoiding sin. And we have to remember that. Our religion is not something negative. It's something fundamentally positive. But it's of elevating our whole life to the supernatural level. This famous saying that, I believe it's St. Augustine, that God became man so that men could become gods. And not taking God's nature, but participating in his nature. And that's what the life of grace is. And in order to do that, we need to act morally on the natural level and then supernaturalized by living our Catholic principles in our everyday life, and that certainly includes in our business and economic life.